Oh, welcome to this A-level video on the life of the Buddha, particularly his Enlightenment, from Karen Armstrong and her book The Buddha, chapter 3. Let's read it and then we can look at it. It was late spring. Scholars have traditionally dated the Enlightenment of Gautama at about the year 528 BCE, though recently some have argued for a later date in the first half of the 5th century. The Pali texts give us some information about what happened that night, but nothing that makes much sense to an outsider who has not been through the Buddhist regime. They say that Gautama mused upon the deeply conditional nature of all life as we know it, saw all his past lives and recovered that secluded and solitary state he had experienced as a child. He then slipped easily into the first jhana, progressed through ever higher states of consciousness until he gained an insight that forever transformed him and convinced him that he had freed himself from the round of samsara and rebirth. But there seems little new about this insight, traditionally known as the Four Noble Truths, and regarded as the fundamental teaching of Buddhism. The first of these verities was the noble truth of suffering, dukkha, that informs the whole of human life. The second truth is that of the cause of suffering was desire, tanha. And the third noble truth Gautama asserted was nibbana. Existed as a way out of this predicament, and finally he claimed that he had discovered the path that leads from suffering and pain to its cessation in the state of nibbana. Okay, so let's look at this. Does Armstrong have any justification for her dating of the Enlightenment? As she says, it was in late spring. Well, what can we say about that? Is she plucking that just out of thin air? Well, why might she have picked late spring? Well, from the previous passage in this article, and you could refer to that, it describes how pleasant the atmosphere of the grove seemed. Now, you have to sort of grow up in India to know that it's not always like that, particularly in the monsoon season. And would it have had that pleasant atmosphere if it was tipping out of the heavens? And when does the monsoon season happen? When does it not happen? Well, late spring would be a good time to sit under a tree in the open air. Other times maybe not. Maybe the reason she says this is because of some textual reference that she hasn't told us about. I've struggled to find one. Maybe there is one that suggests it's late spring. Maybe she's saying this because it's linked to some festival that celebrates the life of the Buddha. For example, in Mahayana there is a Bodhi Day, which is Awakenment Day. That would be the one you'd go for, you'd think, if you want to pin a date in the annual calendar when it is. But the problem is the Bodhi Day, in particularly it's a thing in Japan, is in December, not in early spring, which we'll assume is sort of May, June time. Vesak might be the place to go to. Maybe this is the reason she chooses late spring, because Vesak, which celebrates not just the Enlightenment but his birth and his death, that falls in May, and this might be the reason for this late spring. But she doesn't explain herself, and she doesn't give us reasons for late spring. She just plucks it out and, you know, treats us a bit like we wouldn't understand her reasons. She can do better. As we read on, we need to ask this question: does Armstrong's populist lack of specific scholarly referencing, does it undermine her account of the Buddha? She mentions scholars in the next words, the scholars. Now, if you'd been writing an essay for me and you didn't say which scholars, then I'd mark you down. She doesn't give any footnotes, any endnotes. We don't know which scholars. And then what she goes on to say, have traditionally dated the Enlightenment of Gautama about the year 528 BCE. She doesn't tell us how she arrived at that number. Now, what we can say, if you look into this, in the earliest 20th century, scholars had an earlier dating for the lifetime of the Buddha. For his birth at 563 and to his death at 583. And this date of 528 would comport with the 20th century scholars. But as we read on, she talks about, though some have recently argued for a later date in the first half of the 5th century. So, and this non-traditional dating. Why have some argued for this non-traditional dating? Well, she is referring to an actual debate here, and the key disputed event in the Buddha's life is his death. And in the latter half of the 20th century, some scholars have disputed the earlier 20th century scholars' dating because of different ideas about when he died. But it has to be said, there is no universally agreed dates. And she glosses over this. She does give us some insight into the scholarly debate, but she is glossing over a little bit of this debate. So who would argue for a later date and why? Well, these later 20th century scholars, because of debates around the death of the Buddhism. Now, she doesn't say who we should trust and why. And that's kind of problematic. What exactly do the Pali texts, we move on here, the Pali texts give us some information about what happened that night. The Pali texts give us some information. What exactly do the information do they give us? But you know, Armstrong is not very specific, and she doesn't mention some of the well-known scholars on this. The Theravada scholar Bhikkhu Nanamoli, in his book The Life of the Buddha, or his student and follower Thinissara Bhikkhu, both of them as well have created, or would be accepted at least by Theravada as the authoritative scholars on the Pali Canon, who've sought to draw out piecemeal, particularly Nanamoli in his book The Life of the Buddha, what can we find in the Pali Canon about the Buddha? And we find suggestions about his awakening, his teaching, his 45 years of teaching, at the beginning of his teaching, the first sermon, second, third sermon, and his death. We find all of that in the Pali Canon. But Armstrong engages with little of this. So we read on. But nothing that makes much sense to an outsider who has not been through the regime. That's you and me. You know, she's saying, fascinating. What Buddhist regime is she assuming here? And why is she treating us like idiots, like noddy people? You know, her audience she takes to be Western, secular, pluralist people who are reading this text out of curiosity. And she's not specific about the regime. Perhaps it could be a reference to the Theravada regime of the Fourfold Sangha, how bhikkhus who renounce their ordinary life, their laity life, to become ordained and continue on the middle way life of monastic retreat, monastic meditation, monastic study. Is she talking about the regime you might find typically, for example, in Zen Buddhist monastic practice, or in Pure Land chanting, or in Tibetan tantric rituals? We just don't know. But I think she's saying you can only read the text if you've been through one of these regimes. Which one, she's not clear. Now, I wonder at that. Can anybody, is she saying this is you have to have special lenses to understand the Pali Canon? Why? She doesn't give us an argument why, that you have to have gone through all these. She's smuggling in some supernaturalism here to say, unless you've had this, your hands, some ritual in Tibet or some years of study in the Pali scriptures, that there's lots we can criticize here. We need to say that she is avoiding disputes about interpretation. That's what's important. And she's trying to create this generic, secular Buddha for the modern Western person by not telling us which regime. Now we read on. They say that Gautama mused upon the deeply conditional nature of all life as we know it. Now let's pause there. A key teaching in Buddhism is the conditioned and the unconditioned. At least a key teaching in Theravada, that Nibbana is the unconditioned, the only thing that is not changing. It's a key teaching. Everything is impermanent. Well, here we have Anicca, the first of the three universal truths. So Nibbana is the unconditioned. Everything else is conditioned. That means it arises and it dissolves, as the Pali Canon, Dhammapada statements say. That because of this constant change, we assume we're left dissatisfied because things change. We don't want them to change, because we feel pain, because our body changes, and so on. And ultimately, we have this deep existential problem with anatta, that we are not permanent, that we change, that we are made of nothing permanent, these 5 skandhas. And because of this, we are subject to the delusion. And it's this delusion of permanence that the 3 marks of existence talks about. We just have to remove this. And this is a key part then of the 4 Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path, and the practices that can remove and help us remove this craving, this delusion, and so on. But in Mahayana, the ideas of conditioned and unconditioned are subject to the 2 and 3 truth doctrine. These are false statements. These are a dualistic way of thinking. And in one particular Mahayana Sutra, it talks about not the 3 marks of existence, but the 4 marks of existence. Yes, impermanence, but it's a different word. Yes, suffering, but we include emptiness, Nagarjuna's doctrine and the perfected wisdom literature doctrine of emptiness, hollowness, that even the parts are made of parts. And selflessness. As we go on from emptiness, we realize we're all interconnected. We all interbeing. Then there's no self, there's no you, no I, which leads to compassion. Selflessness leads to compassion. For example, the Zen populist thinker Thich Nhat Hanh says the Buddha taught that Nibbana is the joy of completely extinguishing our ideas that are dualistic, rather than just getting rid of suffering. So we have to bear in mind the Mahayana 2 truth, 3 truth doctrine here. There are different ideas about what it means to talk about conditioned and unconditioned as ways of life, the conditional and the unconditional as we know it. Who knows it? Mahayana Theravada. So we continue. All his past lives and recovered that secluded and solitary street he had experienced as a child. He then slipped into... So there's that reference again to the rose apple tree, Jataka tale. He slipped into the first jhana. Okay, well that's what the rose apple tree says in the Jataka story. Progressed through ever higher states of consciousness and gained insight. Wow, insight that forever transformed him and convinced him that he had freed himself from the round of samsara and rebirth. But there seems nothing new about this insight, traditionally known as the four. What is the insight? The Four Noble Truths, and regarded as fundamental teaching Buddhism. It is the first of these verities, insight or verities. Okay, the noble truth of dukkha, that informs the whole of human life. The second verity or truth, the word verity in Greek means truth. She's showing off. The cause of the suffering is desire. The third verity or noble truth, the predicament. The Gautama asserted Nibbana exists as a way out of this predicament. Finally, he claimed that he discovered the path, the final verity, the fourth noble truth, the eightfold path that leads from suffering and pain to the cessation of state of Nibbana. Well, what's going on here? So, insight's interesting, isn't it? I mean, that just cries out to be thought of as insight meditation, cries out to be thought of as Mahayana. Dukkha is the first verity, the first insight, pain and dissatisfaction and Tana. Now, we're not going over how Mahayana disagree with this, but as we just looked at Thich Nhat Hanh and others, the second noble truth, certainly. Now, are these new? This is what she said. But there seems little new about this insight. Little new. Really? Is there little new about the fourfold truth? Is it just this first insight she's talking about? From the insight that forever transformed him and convinced him that he had freed himself from the round of samsara. What insight is all four of the noble truths. This is a difficult thing to claim. Let's start with dukkha and Tana, suffering and the cause, dissatisfaction and desire. Well, yes, there would have been others who would have claimed. Everybody understood suffering, everybody understood dissatisfaction. That very little knew about that. The second noble truth, Tana, it's the analysis of these words that is new, the fine-tuning, the different kinds of dukkha. The dukkha that's caused by the thought that I will cease to exist. Sankhara dukkha. The type of desire, the desire to be permanent, or the desire to be left alone, Vibhanatana or Bhavnatana. Those are new in some sense. But yes, the Sarmana movement agreed that desire was the cause of suffering. And the extreme ascetics, as part of the Sarmana movement, they tried to get rid of desire by punishing the body. Now the Buddha would, encourage not the punishment of the body, but a middle way, a middle path between austerity and luxury. That's different. That's new. Certainly that's new from the Sarmana, but the ascetic, that's very different. The cause of suffering, the Brahman said, was bad karma. Well, the Buddha kind of said bad karma is, but his remedy is not the prayers of the Brahmin priests at your funeral and you pay them lots of money, but it's your own act of meditation and middle way that is definitely new. So this is a very contested idea that there's little new in Buddhist teaching from what came before. Certainly there's continuity, but there's discontinuity as well. And it's overly simplistic to say there was little new. She needs to give us a little bit more insight and treat us a little bit more as intelligent people in the way that she's writing for us. Moreover, the Brahman ideas of the self in a continual cycle of reincarnation, that wasn't new. The transmigration of the soul, the Buddha rejected in favor of the Atman, but the materialists rejected the belief in the soul. Samsara, everybody agreed with. Moksha and Nibbana are quite similar, very vague ideas, difficult to describe, ineffable. There are competing ideas in Hinduism about moksha. And yes, prayers and meditation is the way to go, not the prayers of the Brahmin priests, just your own meditation is the way to go, your own middle path. Or is it? Mahayana would say it's not your own middle path, it is the compassion towards other people.